And welcome to this session of our EpiDoc training program, for which you can see a link at the bottom of the screen. And in this session, Gabriel Bodard is going to show how to mark up different kinds of editorial corrections in EpiDoc. So please, Gabby.
Great, thank you, Irene. I'm going to give a few examples of kinds of editorial correction that epigraphic and papyrological editions conventionally record. And in particular, we'll see in some of these examples that you can get more information in the edition itself in an EpiDoc XML edition of this than you would in the conventional Leiden edition. And we'll see how that translates to the rendering and the appearance of an edition in this way. And there's a couple of examples of that. So these are the four examples I'm going to give as a sort of outline. Some of these examples, many of these examples will not be using Greek and Latin texts, partly because EpiDoc is used in many other languages and traditions in addition to Greek and Latin, but actually I'm going to be using a couple of English examples just so we can focus on the encoding and not have to worry about staring at the complex markup while also trying to decipher the Greek and Latin that's going on in there. A couple of the examples are Greek and Latin just for variety. So the first example, editorial supplement. This is a fairly straightforward edition. Exactly the same thing occurs in the EpiDoc as occurs in the Leiden, just using XML tags rather than conventional tags. So this is an English example taken from a I think 18th century tombstone, and it may not be immediately obvious, but what this actually says, the context does make it clear, is the word deceased, written very unconventionally, whether by an incompetent stonecutter or as an abbreviation, I'm not sure we know. But so the a diplomatic edition would simply transcribe the characters, but a standard Leiden edition would say we need to insert editorially the missing or understood E and A in the middle of that word, so that it spells deceased in what was the conventional spelling in the 18th century as much as it is now. And so in EpiDoc, as you can find in your guidelines or in your quick reference document, the angle brackets for omitted characters restored by the editor is simply supplied reason omitted, and we can do that both times for the omitted characters, and just for good measure, because we've got that S written unconventionally in reversed character, we could also say, we'll highlight that S and say, the stonecutter has reversed the S. That doesn't necessarily imply that they did it on purpose. It could have been a stylistic choice, or it could have been an error. We don't particularly care either way. So that's the first kind of editorial correction that we can make, where we think the stonecutter did something that they didn't really intend to do, and so we're fixing that. The second example is very much the same sort of thing, but the reverse, where we think the stonecutter wrote the same character or the same piece of information twice, either erroneously or, again, possibly stylistically, but we're going to treat it as an error for this example. So here, this is a Greek example. The first character, I think, is the end of a word, and the rest of the string there reads doulos. The omicron upsilon ligature in the middle of that word makes the omicron to the left of it slightly redundant. If that happens, the standard epigraphic convention would be to put curly braces around that omicron to say there's an omicron on the stone, but we don't think it should be there. So we can kind of ignore it for our reading of the stone in conventional spelling of Greek. And that simply, very straightforwardly, is a surplus element that directly replaces the curly brackets. And we can explicitly say that that omicron upsilon ligature is a ligature by using the high element there. So this again is simply replacing Leiden marks with XML tags. Third example, this is where it gets interesting, because not all of the information that we're encoding here would appear in the text in a conventional edition. So here we'll use an English example. This was not an inscription, but a public document made visible at an epigraphic conference that we attended a few years ago. And there's clearly a scribal error in this text. The author or the scribe of this inscription was not a native speaker of the language they were writing in, and so there's a scribal error. Two characters that looked similar have been substituted for one another. So rather than dear quest, what they actually meant to write was dear guest. So a conventional Leiden edition would put the corrected letter G in these upper half square brackets, and that we could simply tag that as core in the edition. If we saw this edition in our text and we didn't have an image of the inscription, so we didn't necessarily know what the G was corrected from, all we could do was mark it up in EpiDoc in XML as this core tag. However, we do have more information than that. We know that not only was that, should that have been a G, but we also know what it actually was written like. So we can say, here's a choice element, which TI uses when you have two renderings, two encodings of the same piece of text that you might want to display in different contexts. And we can say that the corrected letter is a G, but the uncorrected letter SIC was a Q actually on the inscription. And we can then choose. We can say in our standard edition, we're going to put the G and probably in those upper half square brackets, but in a diplomatic edition, we would print the Q to show that that was actually what was on the surface. Very similar in encoding, but a slightly different phenomenon is a very common case of scribal inversion. So in this text, the scribe has written anerthee, where what they meant was anerethe. And this is again how in Leiden we would encode. That's exactly the same convention as the previous example. It's got those upper half square brackets, and we can again say that in this choice of the two renderings of that same piece of text, that the corrected form is eth, and we put that in lowercase with diacritics if we need them, and the original form that was written on the stone, and in this case I've chosen to write the original form in uppercase because it's diplomatic, because it wouldn't mean anything if it were rendered like this, is written in the other way around. The final example I'm going to give is almost identical to the preceding two examples, but rather than correcting an error that we believe the stonecutter has made, we're simply normalizing a non-standard linguistic form to make it easier for the reader to understand and read this piece of text. It's important to make that distinction because we may want to handle these in different ways. We may want to put corrections where we believe the scribe made an error in the text itself and just point out the incorrect form in an apparatus entry, but we may want to put the regularized forms, we may want to put the irregular forms, the non-standard forms, in the text because they are actually what the scribe wrote and intended to write, and just the explanation to them in an apparatus entry, or possibly in two different apparatus constructs or something. So it can, in some editions, you might choose to differentiate between error and non-standard usage. So here's a Latin inscription, believe it or not, which appears to read "Bixit in pace," and this is clearly a non-standard form. I wouldn't say it's an error because it occurs so often in the Latin inscriptions of North Africa, for example, where I believe this inscription was from. This occurs all the time. So clearly, this was simply just how they were expecting to see this written. So again, we could say for each of those non-standard characters, we could say choice. And in this case, we say we're regularizing to a V, because that's what we'd expect to see in classical Latin. But the original form was a B on the stone. And likewise, we're regularizing to a C from this original K on the stone, because we're expecting to see that. And again, we can decide how we want to print that in the text, and we can decide how we want to print that in an apparatus construct of some kind, if we want to generate those from this markup. An alternate coding practice, just incidentally, some corpora, among them the Duke Databank of Documentary Papyri, would prefer to regularize an entire word than individual letters. And this is particularly useful if one word might have multiple regularizations in it, or if the non-standard usage might be a case ending being different. So you can't just represent, you know, one or two characters as being different from each other and replaced by each other. So we regularize the entire word, and this is exactly the same. The only difference with this is that the apparatus entry would be slightly longer if you chose to render it that way, and you couldn't decide in the text to put some kind of brackets just around the regularized character in the way that you would with corrected characters, or if you were encoding just the individual characters. But those who have chosen this kind of markup, such as I say, the Duke Databank, they don't want to just tag individual characters, because they in any case they want to leave the original form on the main edition and simply have a note in the apparatus saying, you know, for which read Vixit. And so, as I say, that's a project-specific decision. In Leiden, conventionally you would only have the option to either mark up the corrected form in your text, or to keep your text as diplomatic. But in the TEI, in the EpiDoc, we tend to encode both in parallel in this form, and we can, if we want to, generate an apparatus criticus entry from whichever form we don't want to display in the text. Or we could choose for it to appear as a pop-up when we hover over the character, or we could choose to have both characters appearing, you know, superimposed over one each other in some way. There's all sorts of ways in which we could choose to render these. I think generating apparatus criticus is more conventional, and most people would prefer. But that's those are of course several options there. And that's that. Do you want to add anything, Irene?
No, great, thank you.
Cool. Okay, thank you.